Langston Reed, a 62-year-old black pastor and former Army medic, only wanted to defend his right to pray peacefully outside a federal building. But when Judge Clarice Holloway, known for her icy courtroom and racial bias, screamed him down in front of a full court, Langston chose not to fight back with words, but with truth. What he revealed next didn't just clear his name, it shook the entire justice system. What kind of truth could silence a courtroom in seconds? If that pulled you in, don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who believes in justice, and hit subscribe to follow more true power stories. Now let's step into the courtroom. It was supposed to be a routine hearing, just a short procedural session that wouldn't even make the evening news. But within 7 minutes, the judge would be in handcuffs, and no one in that courtroom would ever forget what they saw. When the two federal agents stepped into the courtroom that morning, they didn't announce themselves. They didn't speak. They just stood near the exit doors, tall, silent, and still, like they were waiting for something, or someone. Most people didn't even notice them. Most people were too busy watching the defendant, a calm, quiet black man in his 60s, sitting at the defense table, hands gently folded, eyes steady. His name was Langston Reed. To anyone who didn't know him, Langston looked like someone who had no business being in trouble. There was something about his presence, something worn but dignified. He wasn't angry. He wasn't afraid. If anything, he looked like a man who had already made peace with the storm. Langston was a pastor. He had served as a field medic in Desert Storm and spent the last 20 years counseling grieving families in the poorest corners of the city. His crime, praying out loud on the steps of a federal courthouse. Not shouting, not protesting, just praying quietly for peace. And someone called it a public disruption. At the bench sat Judge Clarice Holloway, and if the courtroom had a god that morning, it was her. She had sat in that chair for over 2 decades with a reputation so cold it could silence a jury with a look. She didn't tolerate delays. She didn't tolerate mistakes. And above all else, she didn't tolerate anyone who questioned her authority, especially not someone like Langston. Clarice Holloway didn't need to raise her voice to intimidate. She had the kind of presence that froze a room just by standing. And people said that when she smiled, which was rare, it was only to punish someone harder than they expected. On the surface, this wasn't even a criminal case. Langston had already paid a fine, but the district had insisted on pursuing further charges. Something about non-compliance, public disruption, contempt of court. It was as if someone wanted to make an example out of him. His lawyer, Naomi Pierce, was the youngest person in the room and likely the most nervous. She'd taken the case because no one else would. She knew what she was up against, and she wasn't naive about the odds. But she was smart, sharper than she looked, and she'd done her homework. She didn't just want to defend Langston. She wanted to stand up to Holloway, even if it cost her everything. Naomi's hand trembled slightly as she set her briefcase on the table. She glanced at Langston, who gave her a small nod. That one gesture steadied her more than any law book could. And then there was the man in the back row sitting perfectly still 3 rows from the exit, dressed in a gray suit that didn't quite match the courtroom's tired walls. He hadn't looked at anyone. Not Langston, not Naomi, not the judge, just the floor in front of him, like he was counting the seconds. His name, though no one knew it yet, was Gabriel Knox. Gabriel wasn't a lawyer. He wasn't family. He wasn't even there as a friend. He was there because he had waited years for this exact moment. And what he carried in the briefcase by his side would change everything. Outside, the sun was starting to break through a patchy sky. Inside, the judge tapped her gavel and called the room to order. "Let's not waste anyone's time," she said without looking at anyone directly. "I assume the defendant understands the charges." Langston rose slowly, not with defiance, but with a quiet kind of strength. There was something about the way he stood that made people sit a little straighter in their seats. Naomi opened her folder, but before she could speak, Judge Holloway cut her off. "Miss Pierce." The judge said, her voice laced with cold sarcasm, "I do hope you're prepared to argue law today, not emotion." There was a flicker of heat behind Naomi's eyes, but she swallowed it. "Yes, Your Honor," she said. Langston turned his head slightly, just enough to meet Gabriel's eyes at the back of the room. And for the briefest moment, something passed between them. A quiet understanding. A readiness. 7 minutes. That's all it would take. And in those 7 minutes, this room, so used to silence, to control, to power, pressed down on the neck of truth, would crack. But not because someone shouted, because someone refused to. Because Langston Reed wasn't there to win. He was there to wait. And sometimes waiting is the loudest thing you can do. The courtroom felt colder than before, though no one had touched the thermostat. It wasn't the weather. It was the way Judge Clarice Holloway leaned forward, her fingers steepled, like she was ready to crush whatever dared to rise. Naomi Pierce rose from her chair, heart thudding just beneath her ribs. She had practiced this moment in the mirror, calm, precise, unshakable. But nothing in her training prepared her for the wall of silence pressing down on her now. She swallowed, steadied her breath, and spoke. "Your Honor." She said my client, Reverend Langston Reed, was not leading a protest. He was engaged in a silent, solitary prayer on the courthouse steps. He was exercising his protected right under the First Amendment freedom of religion. The judge didn't even blink. Miss Pierce Holloway said, her tone like ice sliding across steel. "Is it your position that this court should interpret silent defiance as a holy act?" Naomi blinked. "No, ma'am. I'm saying it wasn't defiance at all. There was no disruption, no—" Holloway cut her off with a flat palm in the air. "Enough. You can package rebellion however you like, scripture suffering silence, but it doesn't change what it is." Langston shifted slightly. His hands still folded, his eyes forward. Naomi opened her mouth to speak again, but Holloway leaned in, her voice suddenly sharp. "You people never understand what order means." The room froze. The words weren't shouted. They didn't need to be. The venom was in the calmness. Naomi's breath hitched. Someone in the gallery dropped a pen, the clatter echoing far too loud in the quiet. Langston slowly stood. He didn't flinch, didn't bristle. He stood like a man who had heard that phrase his entire life from different mouths wearing different uniforms. He looked directly at Holloway. "I do understand order, Your Honor," he said evenly. "I lived it in a tent hospital in Kuwait where the only law was mercy and blood dried faster than justice arrived." Judge Holloway raised her chin, unimpressed. "This isn't war, Mr. Reed. It's a courtroom. You're not a soldier anymore. You're a man on trial." Langston nodded, not in agreement, but in recognition. "I know where I am, ma'am," he said quietly. "But I also know truth doesn't stop at your bench." The gavel slammed hard. "You will not preach in my courtroom." Langston didn't move. "Then stop making it a pulpit." A few people in the gallery inhaled sharply. Naomi's head turned. She caught the movement, a woman seated near the back, dabbing her eyes with a lace handkerchief. The woman's shoulders trembled. She didn't look at anyone. She just stared at Langston like she was seeing something she had buried years ago rise to the surface. Judge Holloway stood from her bench. "I will not be spoken to like this in my own court," she snapped. "One more outburst, and I will hold you in contempt." Naomi stepped forward fast. "Your Honor, with respect, my client has not raised his voice. He's answered your questions respectfully, and—" "You're one more word from joining him in a cell," Holloway snapped. Her voice cracked for the first time, not out of fear but control slipping. Then something even stranger happened. Langston smiled, just faintly. He turned slightly toward Naomi. "It's all right," he said, calm as ever. "Truth sounds like rebellion to people who've made peace with lies." The gallery was dead silent. Naomi looked toward the back row at the man still sitting motionless. Gabriel Knox hadn't blinked. His briefcase hadn't moved. But Naomi could swear just for a second that his lips curled upward. Not in amusement, in readiness. Because now she understood what this was. This wasn't a legal proceeding. This was a punishment ceremony. Langston's real crime wasn't kneeling in prayer. It was standing too tall afterward. And now everyone was watching to see if he'd bow. But he wouldn't. And someone was waiting for that. The courtroom had emptied, but the tension lingered in the air like smoke after a fire. Langston sat in the hallway outside, his hands resting on his knees, eyes locked on the tiled floor. Naomi stood beside him, flipping through her notes, though she wasn't reading them. Her jaw was clenched, and her breath came shallow. He finally broke the silence, voice steady but low. "You ever won a fight you had to stand alone for?" Naomi looked at him, surprised by the question. She hesitated before answering. "I've stood alone plenty of times. But winning—" She shook her head. "Not when the rules keep changing halfway through." Langston offered a quiet smile. "That's because this isn't a courtroom anymore. It's a stage. We're not arguing facts. We're trying to survive the performance. Before she could respond, footsteps echoed down the hallway, measured, deliberate. Gabriel Knox, the quiet man from the back row, walked toward them without a word. His presence didn't demand attention, but it held it. He stopped in front of Langston and reached into his coat. From the inside pocket, he pulled a plain white envelope and handed it to him. "This will change everything," he said calmly, "but not yet." Naomi stepped forward, eyes narrowing. "Who are you?" Gabriel turned to her slowly. His voice didn't rise, but the weight behind it was unmistakable. "Someone who's lost enough." Langston turned the envelope in his hands as if trying to measure its meaning by feel alone. "Why now?" he asked quietly. Gabriel took a breath, the kind that comes from deep in the chest, like something long buried was about to surface. "My brother," he said. 19. Holloway sentenced him for a first-time offense, 6 years. No bail. He died inside 18 months later. They called it a fight, but the bruises said different. Naomi's arms dropped to her sides. "I filed requests, asked for reports video. They sealed everything, said it was a matter of institutional safety." He gave a bitter laugh. A misdemeanor in a low-security facility became a national secret. Langston looked at him. Now, really looked. "You've been following her this long," Gabriel nodded. "I've documented every case that raised a red flag, every time she silenced a voice like yours. 15 years of names, patterns, recordings, clerks who whispered and then walked away." Naomi stepped closer. "And you never spoke out." "I did," he said, voice calm but tight. "And the system shut me down, disbarred me in 2 states. They called it professional misconduct. But all I did was ask the wrong questions." A pause. "Now I wait until the moment no one can ignore the answer." Langston folded the envelope and slid it inside his coat. He didn't rush. His movements were deliberate, respectful. Then he looked up, met Gabriel's eyes, and said, "Then maybe we're not strangers, Mr. Knox. Maybe we just fought the same war." Gabriel gave a small nod, the kind men give when they've carried too much to say more. Then he turned and walked away, disappearing down the corridor like a shadow fading with the light. Naomi stood quiet for a moment, processing all of it. Then she looked at Langston. "What's in that envelope?" she asked. Langston didn't answer directly. He touched his chest just above the pocket, the part of the truth that fights back. They stood in silence until the voice of the bailiff broke through the hall. "All rise. Court is back in session." Langston rose slowly, straightening his back like a soldier returning to formation. Naomi stepped beside him. Neither spoke, but as they walked back toward the double doors, the energy between them had changed. The storm wasn't over, but now they knew which direction the wind was blowing. When court resumed, it didn't feel like just a hearing anymore. It felt like something bigger had settled over the room, like air holding its breath. Langston stood beside Naomi at the defense table. Judge Holloway returned to the bench with a clipped stride, as if she was trying to remind everyone who the room belonged to. Her eyes landed on Langston like a weight, and her lips curled into something just shy of a smirk. So she said, resting her elbow on the bench, "You think praying makes you noble?" There was no objection, no gasp from the gallery, just silence, dense and waiting. Langston didn't flinch. He took a step forward, not rushing, not defying, just stepping into himself. "I don't pray to be noble," he said, voice calm and steady. "I pray so I don't forget what justice should feel like." The judge leaned back, her expression unchanged, but the gallery shifted slightly. Naomi's fingers curled around the edge of the table. "Mr. Reed," the judge replied coolly, "you are not on trial for your thoughts. You're on trial for defying an order in a federal space." Langston met her gaze. "An order that told me not to kneel, not to bow my head, not to be still. That wasn't an order for safety. That was an order for silence." The judge's hand hovered near her gavel, but she didn't strike it. Maybe she knew it wouldn't be enough. Naomi stepped forward, trying to speak, but Holloway cut her off with a dismissive wave. "You've had your say, counselor. If your client wants to speak so badly, let him. At least he's not hiding behind a law degree." Langston glanced at Naomi, and she paused. Then, with the smallest nod, she stepped back. Langston walked forward, one pace, then another. He turned not to the judge, but to the room. "To some of you," he began, "I'm just a man who prayed where I shouldn't have. That's what the record will say. But the truth is, I wasn't praying to be seen. I was praying not to disappear." Someone coughed in the gallery. Others sat straighter. "Because when they arrest you for being quiet, Langston continued. It's not your voice they fear. It's your presence. Naomi watched silent as the tide shifted. For the first time, Langston wasn't defending himself. He was standing for something much larger. From the back of the courtroom, a sound rose, barely audible. A woman's breath catching. Naomi turned her head and saw her, Mrs. Thelma Grace. The older woman who had wept earlier. Now she sat perfectly still, both hands clutching a small photograph against her chest. Her son, gone years ago in another courtroom where justice looked away. Naomi felt something pull in her chest. Langston kept speaking. They told me I broke the rules, but nobody asked who wrote those rules or who they were meant to break. He turned slightly toward the bench. You don't have to raise your voice to speak truth, but sometimes dignity has to stand up in a room full of noise. The judge straightened, her face tightening. This is not a speech hall, Mr. Reed. Langston gave the slightest nod. You're right. It's a courtroom. So let's talk about the law. Let's talk about the right to pray, the right to peace, the right to be human without permission. Naomi stepped forward now, voice soft but clear. He's not just defending himself, Your Honor, she said. He's defending every voice that courtroom silenced before his. And for a moment, Holloway had no response. The silence didn't feel like defeat. It felt like the first time the truth had been heard out loud, and nobody dared to look away. The courtroom emptied slowly that afternoon, but Naomi stayed behind. She sat alone at the defense table, her fingers hovering over the thick envelope Gabriel had handed Langston. It had been resting there since lunch, untouched, like it carried weight beyond its size. Langston gave her a quiet nod, then stepped outside. He didn't say a word, just left her to it. And somehow that silence made her hands move. She peeled back the flap and pulled out 2 items, a USB drive and a folded letter wrapped around a stack of printouts. The handwriting on the note was tight and controlled, footage from the east stairwell, unedited, time-synced. Frame 2317 shows the truth. Use it when you're ready. She plugged the drive into her laptop, fingers trembling without her consent. The courtroom security footage loaded slowly. It was raw, no audio, just images time-stamped. Naomi scanned the hallway view, fast-forwarding through the uneventful frames, and then she saw it. The man who knelt in front of the building, head bowed, hands resting calmly on his knees, wasn't Langston. He was taller, leaner, younger. Naomi froze the frame at 2317, heart thudding. It was undeniable. The man arrested in the video wasn't the man sitting beside her in court. She swallowed hard, then turned to the documents. Bank transactions, highlighted names. Her eyes caught the one that made her mouth go dry, Dennis Fry, the prosecution's key witness. There, in bold ink, was a deposit into his account. $5,000. 2 days after Langston's arrest. The payer, a PAC tied to Judge Holloway's former clerk. Naomi rose from her seat, almost knocking the chair over. Her knees wobbled not from fear, but from the sheer weight of what this meant. The trial wasn't just wrong. It was rigged. Outside the judge's chamber, Assistant District Attorney Andrew Kessler was still packing his files. Naomi didn't knock. She entered like the truth had no time for formalities. I need to show you something, she said. Kessler looked up, caught off guard by her tone. She handed him the papers one by one. First the image still, then the transfer records. His hand twitched when he reached the final page. He didn't speak, just blinked. This can't be authenticated, he stammered, but it was weak, mechanical. It's court-verified surveillance, Naomi replied. Different angle than the prosecution used, and the transaction traceable. Kessler sat back, the color draining from his face. Naomi's voice dropped lower, sharper. You knew something felt off, didn't you? He didn't answer, just stared at the photo of Dennis Fry smiling outside a bank. Naomi turned to leave, but paused. Tomorrow morning, she said over her shoulder, I put this on the record. As she walked back into the hallway, she found Langston leaning against the wall, arms crossed, looking like he'd been waiting without asking. She handed him a single printout, the still image from the security footage. He looked at it quietly, then back at her. So he said I wasn't praying alone. Naomi smiled, tired but sharper than before. No. But they counted on you being the only one without proof. Langston folded the paper slowly, carefully, and slipped it into his pocket. There's a reason truth doesn't shout, he said, eyes steady. It waits. For people brave enough to say it out loud. Naomi looked back toward the courtroom where the echoes of that silence still lingered like smoke. "Tomorrow morning," she said softly, "I say it." The morning air inside the courtroom felt sharper, heavier. Even the fluorescent lights seemed more alert. Naomi walked in with slow certainty, her heels tapping a rhythm of intent against the cold tile. The gallery was filled beyond capacity. Some faces held hope, others worry, but all of them were waiting. Langston Reed entered quietly, his face unreadable. He gave a nod to Naomi, then looked around as if memorizing the moment. The storm hadn't broken yet, but he knew it was close. Judge Holloway sat higher today, back straighter, voice more clipped. "Let's proceed." Naomi stood. Her hands weren't shaking anymore. "Your Honor." She said the defense requests to present new evidence, a second video angle that directly contradicts the prosecution's narrative and financial records pertaining to the state's key witness. Holloway didn't flinch. "Play it." The video began, silent, grainy. The footage showed a figure kneeling quietly, but something was off. Height, shoulders, posture. It wasn't Langston. A low gasp slipped through the room. Naomi pointed. "This individual is not my client." Holloway's expression didn't change, but her fingers curled tightly around the gavel. "Coincidence," she said coldly. "Grainy footage proves nothing." Naomi stepped forward. "Then let's follow the money." She handed a file to the bailiff who delivered it to the bench. Holloway skimmed through it. Naomi continued, voice low but resolute. "The state's witness, Dennis Fry, received a $5,000 payment 2 days after he testified. The transaction came from a PAC run by Madison Klein, a former aide in your chambers." A silence fell. Holloway's eyes darted. "Call Mr. Fry." The courtroom door opened and Fry walked in, visibly nervous, hands clenched into fists. He took the stand, swallowing hard. Naomi faced him. "Mr. Fry, did you receive this payment?" He hesitated. It was a gift from a friend." Naomi didn't blink. "Was that friend a woman named Madison Klein?" Silence. "Yes," he said finally. "Did anyone instruct you on what to say when testifying against Mr. Reed?" Fry looked at Holloway, then back at Naomi. "They told me what to say, said it was for the good of the court." Whispers swept the room. Naomi turned to the judge. "We request immediate dismissal of all charges and the opening of a formal investigation into judicial misconduct." Holloway slammed the gavel. "Enough. This court will not be hijacked by theatrics." Then from the back a calm voice cut through. "Your Honor, respectfully, this court no longer belongs to you." Gabriel Knox stepped forward, dressed sharply, a man who carried silence like a weapon. He handed a sealed envelope to the bailiff. "I represent the Office of the Inspector General. As of 7:52 a.m. this morning, Judge Holloway, your courtroom has been placed under federal oversight." Gasps. Some stood up, others froze. Holloway ripped open the letter. Her face drained of color. "You have no right," she whispered. Gabriel didn't raise his voice. "I have the law." Naomi turned to Langston, who hadn't moved. He sat there still as stone. "I told you truth waits," he said softly, "but it never waits forever." And that was when the silence fell. Not from fear, not from confusion, but from something else, respect. For the first time in years, that courtroom remembered what justice was supposed to feel like. The next morning began without fanfare. No crowd protests, no news vans swarming outside the courthouse. But inside, there was a quiet current building, like the stillness before a storm that doesn't come with thunder, but with truth. Naomi entered the courtroom with steady steps. She carried nothing but a worn legal folder tucked tightly under her arm, and a quiet determination in her eyes. Langston followed behind, walking as if he already knew this room was no longer what it used to be. Judge Holloway took her seat as if nothing had changed. Same rigid posture, same cold gaze, but the room was no longer afraid of her. Something had shifted, and everyone felt it. It started with a chair creaking in the back row. Slowly, one woman rose to her feet. Her hands trembled slightly as she held a small framed photograph to her chest. Mrs. Thelma Ward. No one had noticed her before, but now all eyes turned. She cleared her throat, and her voice, though aged, came through with unexpected strength. "My son," she began, "was just 17 when he was accused of stealing a car. He didn't steal anything. He was walking home from church with his Bible still in his hands." The room stilled. They gave him 5 years. Judge Holloway said she was making an example out of him. He didn't make it to year 2. He died in a prison infirmary. They said it was a fight, but I know my son. He never raised a hand in anger. Her hands clutched the frame tighter, as though holding her son one last time. "I stayed quiet," she said, "because I thought that was what dignity looked like. But dignity without truth is just grief dressed in silence." Naomi watched her throat tightening. She'd reviewed files, built timelines, even found evidence. But nothing had prepared her for the raw weight of a mother's truth laid bare in a courtroom that had silenced so many. Judge Holloway's face remained unreadable, but for the first time her fingers clenched the edge of her bench. Power shaken ever so slightly. Then a man in a gray suit stood up from the opposite side. Mid-50s former prosecutor, once a fixture in that very courtroom. "I was forced to resign 6 years ago," he said, "because I wouldn't sign off on the sentencing memo Judge Holloway insisted on. It was for a 12-year-old boy caught with a candy bar. She wanted maximum juvenile detention. I told her it would destroy him. She said, and I quote, 'Better they learn early who's in charge.'" Gasps didn't erupt, they simmered. The kind of shock that leaves people staring, still processing. Naomi stepped forward almost involuntarily. Her voice didn't rise, it didn't need to. "Your Honor," she said softly. "What we're hearing today isn't just about Langston Reed. It's not even just about injustice. It's about the cost of silence, about how many lives were reshaped or ended because no one felt safe to speak." Judge Holloway opened her mouth, but Naomi held up a hand not to interrupt, but to breathe. "I used to think the law was a shield." Naomi continued, "Something you could hold up and say, 'This will protect us.' But the law is only as good as the people trusted to carry it. And if those people silence others, it's no longer justice. It's performance." There was no applause, no movement. Just breath, the whole room breathing in the moment together. Langston turned his head toward Mrs. Thelma, who was slowly lowering her photo into her lap. He leaned in close enough that only she could hear him. "Your silence ends today," he said gently, "and I'll carry the rest." She nodded, eyes glistening. In that moment, Naomi realized the case was no longer just a legal battle. It was a reckoning not only with a system, but with all the silent rooms it had built. The ones filled with people who had waited years, decades for a moment like this one. And now that the silence had broken, it wasn't going back. No gavel could stop that, no robe could silence it. And as the court recessed for lunch, no one left their seat. Not because they were told to stay, but because they wanted to witness what came next. The courtroom was unusually quiet for a moment that would later make national headlines. No murmurs, no shuffling feet, just a strange collective stillness, like everyone knew the air itself was about to change. Judge Clarice Holloway sat high above the room, her gavel resting like a loaded weapon within reach. But even from that bench, she could feel it. The shift. The eyes that once dropped to the floor when she entered now met her stare without blinking. The deference that once cloaked her in silent power was thinning thread by thread. Then the doors opened. 2 federal agents stepped into the room, their dark suits and calm posture sending a ripple down the rows. The taller one, Agent Marin, spoke clearly but without aggression. "Judge Clarice Holloway," he said, holding up the folded document. "You are hereby placed under federal arrest under suspicion of judicial misconduct, civil rights violations, and conspiracy to obstruct justice." The words seemed to hang in the air like fog. For a split second, no one moved. Even Holloway didn't react until she did. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping behind her. "This is absurd," she snapped. "You don't storm into a federal courtroom and insult the bench. I kept order in this city." Her voice echoed sharp and commanding, but it didn't land the way it used to. From the third row, Gabriel Knox rose to his feet, slowly adjusting the sleeve of his coat, as if brushing off dust from the past. "You kept fear," he said plainly. "There's a difference." Holloway turned to him, eyes wide, like she'd only just realized he'd been there all along. For a woman who'd built a fortress out of control, watching it slip brick by brick was more than unsettling. It was intolerable. She reached for her gavel like it might still silence everything. "You're making a spectacle," she hissed. "This is theater." One of her clerks, a young woman who had sat at her right hand for 3 years, took a step back. The bailiff who once jumped at her every order stayed frozen in place. "Enforce the law," Holloway barked. "Remove that man from my courtroom." But no one moved, not this time. Then Naomi stood. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "The law is being enforced," she said, "just not by you." The agents advanced gently but firmly. Holloway backed against her bench, her voice cracking for the first time all day. You think you've won something? She spat at Naomi. You think justice is a parade of victims crying in a courtroom? You'll see. The world still belongs to people like me. Langston rose. And when he did, it was like time slowed just a little. No rush, no anger. Just the weight of someone who had seen more than most and had nothing left to fear. You sat in that chair thinking no one could ever judge you, he said quietly. But justice remembers, even when people forget, even when courts forget. He took a single step closer, not toward her, but toward the people watching the ones who had once been afraid to speak. It waits, Langston added, and when it finally arrives, it doesn't knock. The agents gently reached for Holloway's wrists. For a second, she didn't resist. But as the cold click of the handcuffs closed around her, she lunged not in violence, but in desperation. I built this court, she yelled. I made this place work. You don't understand what it's like when people think rules don't apply to them. Gabriel stepped forward, his voice low and steady. No, he said, we understand perfectly. We just stopped pretending you were the solution. There was no applause. This wasn't a moment for celebration. But when Holloway was finally led down from the bench, it was as if gravity shifted in the room. The weight of her presence, once suffocating, was lifted. Not entirely, but just enough for people to breathe again. She passed by the rows where she'd once instilled fear with a glance. No one shouted. No one sneered. They just watched. Some with eyes still wide, some with a kind of quiet reverence. Not for her, but for the fact that justice had moved. Naomi remained at her desk, staring straight ahead, barely blinking. It had happened. The woman who had loomed over every word of her legal career was gone, taken not by rage, not by force, but by truth, finally standing tall. And Langston? He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply sat back down and folded his hands like a man returning to prayer, not because the fight was over, but because it had finally started to mean something. The courtroom stood silent, not in fear, but in respect. For truth, for justice, and for the quiet people who never stopped believing either one was possible. The next morning, the courtroom felt nothing like the one from yesterday. It wasn't just that Holloway's bench was empty, it was that the room itself had changed, as if it had exhaled after years of holding its breath. Judge Mitchell Roy now sat at the front, a man whose quiet presence seemed to settle the room without commanding it. He didn't rush. He didn't posture. He simply opened a folder, looked out at the people gathered, and spoke with a clarity that felt almost too gentle for a courtroom that had recently seen so much rage. In light of the evidence presented, he said, and in accordance with the powers granted to this bench, all charges against Mr. Langston Reed are hereby dismissed. Furthermore, this court acknowledges that the previous proceedings failed to uphold the standards of justice required under both state and federal law. No one clapped. No one needed to. Naomi's breath caught in her chest. She had held it for days, maybe longer than that. And now it trembled loose, carrying with it a pressure she hadn't even realized had settled in her bones. Her eyes filled before she could stop them, but she didn't look away. Langston simply nodded, his hands folded calmly in his lap. There was no fist raised, no triumphant grin. Just a man who had been dragged through fire and made it to the other side, scarred, yes, but unburned. As people stood to leave, Andrew Kessler made his way forward, avoiding Naomi's eyes at first. He looked older than he had 2 days ago. Maybe it was the lighting, or maybe it was the weight of truth finally catching up to him. He stopped in front of Langston, then turned to Naomi. His voice was quiet, but it reached every corner of the room. I stayed quiet, he said. I watched things happen that I knew were wrong, and I convinced myself silence was safer. I was wrong. Naomi didn't speak. She didn't have to. There are moments when words would only get in the way. Langston stood now slowly. He didn't shake Kessler's hand, but he met his eyes, and for a man like Kessler, that was enough, maybe more than he deserved. Langston looked out toward the benches at the faces that had once feared to speak, and the ones who still did. He turned slightly toward Naomi and finally spoke. I walked through that fire for one reason, he said, to prove it could be walked through. Naomi smiled, but it was the kind that carried 1,000 memories behind it, some painful, some healing. You didn't just walk through it, she said, her voice a little hoarse. You cleared the smoke for the rest of us. There was something sacred about that silence that followed something more than relief, more than closure. It was the sound of a system being forced to look at itself in the mirror. Not all at once, but enough to start. Judge Roy stepped down from the bench, his robe barely brushing the ground as he passed Langston and Naomi on his way out. He didn't say anything either, but the respectful nod he gave was more honest than any apology. Outside, the press had gathered, microphones extended like claws, cameras clicking like insects. But Langston paused at the courthouse steps. He looked at the crowd, then at Naomi, and then back at the doors behind him. "This story doesn't belong to the news," he said quietly. "It belongs to the people who lived it, who paid for it, who lost things they'll never get back." Naomi didn't answer. She just stood beside him. In that moment, no title, no verdict, no headline could carry the weight of what had been corrected. It wasn't just a court record, it was a memory, a life, a truth that refused to stay buried. And for once, the system didn't get to write the ending. Langston Reed did. When Langston stepped out of the courthouse, it wasn't noise that greeted him. It wasn't celebration or protest or anything loud. It was silence, but a different kind this time. Not the kind that comes from fear. This silence carried weight, respect, wonder, healing. The steps were crowded. Reporters with notebooks, neighbors with folded arms, strangers with questions in their eyes. No one rushed him. No one dared to. He walked slowly, the sun catching on the faint silver at his temples, the same calm in his posture he had always carried even when shackled. And in the front row of the crowd, a boy no older than 10, eyes wide with something close to awe, stepped forward, barely lifting his voice above a whisper. "Did you win, sir?" Langston looked at him for a long moment, then offered a quiet smile, not triumphant, not bitter. Just knowing. "I didn't win," he said. "I just waited long enough for justice to catch up." The boy blinked, and something shifted in his face. He didn't fully understand the meaning, not yet, but he would remember that answer for a long time. Inside, Naomi stood before a row of microphones, her voice steady, her back straighter than it had ever been. Effective immediately, she said, "Our office will begin the process of re-examining every case overseen by Judge Holloway. No name will be too old, no file too buried." It wasn't a headline, it was a promise, one that would keep echoing long after the cameras turned off. Elsewhere, in a modest federal office that looked like it hadn't been renovated in decades, Gabriel Knox sat beneath the quiet hum of a desk lamp. His sleeves were rolled up. His tie lay discarded beside a coffee cup gone cold. In front of him, 70 files, all marked with names that once disappeared in a system designed to forget them. He didn't touch them yet. He just sat with them, his hand resting on the first folder, like someone laying a palm on a gravestone, not for mourning but for memory, and maybe finally for movement. And then sometime later, when the crowds had gone and the headlines had started shifting to newer storms, Langston sat quietly on the front porch of his home. The same worn chair, the same view of the oak tree across the street, the same quiet he had prayed in every morning before all of this began. A neighbor walked by and waved. He nodded back. The night air was cool, the stars just starting to break through the velvet of evening. He folded his hands and looked out at nothing in particular. He didn't speak to an audience. There were no microphones. But if you were sitting there with him close enough to hear, you would have caught the words he finally let go. Today wasn't a verdict. It was a beginning. And somehow that beginning felt louder than any verdict ever had. Because justice doesn't always arrive in time. Sometimes it limps. Sometimes it stutters. But when it comes, it carries more than law. It carries memory. It carries reckoning. And if we're lucky, it carries the kind of quiet that teaches us how to listen again. The echo of Langston's story would not end here. It would live in every reopened file, in every young lawyer who refused to back down, in every mother who found courage in Thelma Ward's voice, and in every child who dared to ask the hard question, then listened closely for the answer. That was the real victory. Not that the system broke, but that someone stayed long enough to help rebuild it. Sometimes justice doesn't come with thunder. Sometimes it walks quietly in the shoes of those who refuse to give up. This story wasn't just about one trial. It was about resilience, integrity, and the power of standing firm even when the system tries to silence you. If this story spoke to you, please like the video, share it with someone who believes in truth, and subscribe to Mr. Mac's Stories for more unforgettable stories that inspire, heal, and challenge the world we live in. Your support means everything. It gives our team the strength to keep creating stories that not only entertain, but open hearts and minds. At Mr. Max Stories, we believe memories carry power, and through storytelling, that power becomes legacy. Let's keep that memory alive together.